Has there ever been another splash screen so instantly recognisable which has perfectly encapsulated such a nostalgia-evoking snapshot of the era of gaming history from which it came as this?
EA Sports Big.
I'll be honest, I can't think of anything. EA Sports Big was a brand that dominated the early to mid 2000s during its heyday. If it was a video game that featured colourful graphics, insane physics and absurd yet brilliant gameplay loosely tied around a real world sport, you could safely assume that it was the product of EA Sports Big. Today we'll be looking at the game that started it all, for the PlayStation 2 era, EA Sports Big, as well as my own enduring love and joy for the gaming medium. That's right, we're looking at SSX. The PlayStation 2 launched a mere 3 months into the new millennium, to eventually become the best-selling video game console of all time. As of the beginning of 2013, over 158 million consoles have been sold. Of course, a console is only as good as the games it can run, and fortunately, the PS2's catalogue is thousands deep, featuring an astronomical number of smash hits and hidden gems alike. I'm revealing my biases here, seeing as this was the generation of consoles and era of gaming which shaped my childhood, but I honestly reckon that the late 90s through mid 2000s was a golden age for the interactive medium. You'll note that I have already covered several games of this epoch, and I will continue to do so with many more in the future. One of the many titles to release within the PS2's first year was our game in question, SSX. SSX was released to fanfare and jubilation on October 26, 2000, marking the first appearance of what would eventually become an all-time classic extreme sports series. It was also my first ever video game. Seeing as this is somewhat of a milestone for the Having a Mosey series, being its 10th episode, I thought I'd mark the occasion by going right back to the beginning of my own gaming career. SSX is an extreme sports series that is unlike any other that has come since. As AAA gaming has pivoted away from its arcadey roots and cemented itself more into stone-cold reality, SSX was all about utterly off-the-wall tricks, blistering speeds, and a colourful cast that took pratfalls, wipeouts, and tanked supposedly serious injuries, as well as your average Looney Tunes character.
Someone call the doctor!
Needless to say, people loved it. They loved it so much that it went on to have multiple sequels and even a soft reboot that would come out years later. Seeing as it is the first game of the series, it's also one of the more basic entries. However, what is here is excellent and is a solid foundation for what came next. Everybody rightfully loves SSX Tricky and SSX 3, but neither would exist were it not for the first entry, the house that SSX built. So, what are the fundamentals of SSX? Simply put, SSX is a snowboarding game. To elaborate further, it's an extreme, over-the-top arcade racing game in which you're tasked with navigating a snowboarder of your choice from the top of a mountain to the bottom. There is no story mode in SSX, and as such no appropriate section for this video. As someone who usually relies on the plot to throw myself into one of these reviews, this has of course thrown the entire process into chaos. Instead, upon booting up the main menu of SSX, you're presented with two modes. These are Single Event and World Circuit. Single Event largely functions as the quick play mode of sorts and is useful should you wish to jump into a particular track with a certain character quickly, but isn't tied at all to any form of progression. Instead, you'll probably be spending most of your time in the World Circuit. World Circuit will allow you to unlock even more characters and tracks to enjoy in the Single Event mode. The campaign is a straightforward structure in which you must select a character and guide them to the podium across 6 different races, as well as achieving the highest scores in 6 different show-off events. 7 tracks are featured in the World Circuit, and 5 are shared between the racing and show-off modes. However, the stage Aloha Ice Jam is exclusive to the race, and Pipe Dream can only be found in show-off. I don't mind this distinction as it gives each type of event a bit more identity. Each of the 5 shared tracks are identical whether you're racing or showing off, so having the variety in the track playlists, even if just a little, helps to offset feeling as if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. This is particularly helpful seeing as to fully complete the game, you'll have to run through the campaign 8 whole times, once for each character. Fortunately, the campaign is fairly generous in how you can proceed. In Show Off, it's not particularly hard to get the gold medal in each area, you just have to get creative. The races take place over 3 legs, and the position you reach in the first 2 doesn't matter, just so long as it's within the top 3. Your position in the final race solely dictates your medal. SSX has a great lineup of characters in which to enjoy the campaign. It's comprised of 4 boys, 3 girls, and the Terminator. Depending on who you choose, you'll need to account for how they play, because they all have different base stats. Jurgen here is an absolute monster, sturdy on his feet, but with a frame that impedes his ability to pull off as many tricks as his peers. Meanwhile, someone like Mac is a bit more of an all-rounder, with decent stats across the board. There's a reason he's listed first in the character selection. Honestly, starting from scratch with any of these characters after being used to the fluidity of later games was quite the struggle for me. You'll increase their stats upon successfully completing each event, but when you play a character for the first time, they feel almost as stiff as the boards they ride on. Frequent was the occasion early on where I'd overcommit to a trick and watch helplessly as my on-screen persona plunged to certain doom. Thankfully, with a few upgrades under their belt, it became a lot easier to pull off insane moves and combinations, though not quite to the extent of later games in the series. There are 3 kinds of snowboards to choose from, dramatically switching up what kind of style you should be prioritizing. These are Freestyle, Alpine, and BX. Freestyle are small boards that are heavily focused on tricks, and you'll want to use these whenever you're taking part in a show-off event. Alpine is a much longer board, with a clear front and back end, which attain the higher speeds, making them theoretically very useful in the races. And finally, BX is an all-rounder with stats somewhere between the 2. I'll be honest, I really don't like the Alpine boards. I always find it a right pain keeping it facing the right way. Considering the character Hero is almost exclusively bound to one of these boards, I don't like him very much either. Regardless, despite its limitations, I still had a fantastic time playing through SSX for the purposes of this review. Fortunately, the gameplay isn't the only thing to have aged well either. As well as having timeless moment-to-moment gameplay, I would also argue that SSX has aged very well from a visual standpoint too. Of course, it is somewhat hampered by the 23-year-old technology that houses it, as well as my lack of decent upscaling, but from an aesthetic standpoint, I think that it still holds up. Firstly, I want to talk about the 8 different tracks on which SSX takes place. In short, those are Snowdream, Elysium Alps, Mercury City Meltdown, Mesa Blanca, Tokyo Megaplex, Aloha Ice Jam, Pipe Dream, and Untracked. Now that I've listed those out to you, I'm reasonably confident that you could successfully identify each track in practically every bit of gameplay footage that you've seen so far in this review. Each track is clearly defined from its peers, taking place in wildly varied locations with radically different layouts, set pieces, and lighting. Despite both being nighttime events, the dimly lit streets of Mercury City Meltdown contrast tellingly with the bright, colourful setting of Snowdream. Having varied tracks in a racing game may not be the biggest flex in the world, but I do think that it's rather impressive, considering that they're all variations upon the Snowy Mountain theme. As a quick aside, my personal favourite track in the first game's lineup is Elysium Alps. It's by far the longest, with multiple lengthy shortcuts that can radically change each run-through of the course that you do. Tokyo Megaplex is the more famous and traditional choice, but I really don't think that it came into its own until the second game. Another thing that the SSX series must be complimented on is its sound design. Even in this first entry, the soundtrack is dynamic, and the sound effects themselves are wonderful, enhancing the gameplay further by providing another kind of feedback. For example, when curving one's way down SSX's many slopes, you'll usually be accompanied by some appropriately groovy Turn of the Millennium pop music. However, upon cresting over a ramp and getting some big air, the tune recedes, replaced instead by the whoosh of air around you. Upon successfully landing a trick with the incredibly satisfying sound effect, the music kicks back in. As you can see, it's very gratifying and keeps the gameplay flowing nicely. Of course, if you're like me, you'll eventually bugger up a trick from time to time, causing your character to come crashing down back to earth unceremoniously. This is usually accompanied by a very entertaining interjection from the game's commentary, offsetting too much potential frustration.
How graceful!
Sometimes, however, you will fall, and it will take an excruciatingly long time to get back on your feet again. On occasions like this, it's probably better to just skip the fanfare and mash the instant reset button. All in all, SSX is still a solid game, absolutely worth the very low price of admission. There are few things in gaming as satisfying as blazing a trail through the snow, landing an absurd trick, and pulling off a cheeky last-minute flip as you cross the finish line. This may sadly be a foreign concept to some of my younger viewers, seeing as this is a product of a different time, a bygone era, but as a quick bonus point, SSX has cheat codes. There aren't many and are mostly rather mundane, but there's one that absolutely bears mention, and here it is. My god, look at him go! Running Man mode handles exactly as if he was still on the board, and I honestly can't tell if that makes it more difficult or not. Regardless, so concludes our time today with SSX and this 10th episode of the Having a Mosey series. Regarding the game itself, SSX was a fantastic time, but SSX Tricky is even better. I look forward to eventually covering that game over the course of this show, as well as its subsequent entries. In the meantime, thank you to all of you that have joined me so far or are just joining me on this passion project of mine. Under various names over the years, Having a Mosey is something that I've wanted to create for a very long time. So to finally make it happen, as well as receiving so much positivity in the form of feedback and engagement on it so far, has been nothing short of amazing, and I'm very excited for the future of this channel. Having a Mosey through SSX is going to be a mid-season finale of sorts, not because I'm pausing or going anywhere, but simply because of the nature of this next game. The next episode of Having a Mosey will be on a game that easily sits amongst my personal top 3, and I want to take the extra time to do it the justice it deserves. So please do consider joining me next time when I'll be talking about a different game. A game of fantastical whimsy and friendships, of knights and castles, of being and belonging, of despair and ruin, and perhaps most importantly, the melodies of life.